What comes to your mind when you picture someone who's resilient? And let's just take a collective moment here to think about that. Because usually we hear that it's one person who's faced a setback and they remain hopeful and willing to work through the challenges to return to some sort of life they had before. Maybe you've heard the phrase pick themselves up by their bootstraps to describe this type of person. We know we have, but that doesn't always work and sometimes isn't even applicable, as we continually say. So, we have a guest today who's going to help us examine that image we have and help us understand what we're missing. She'll tell us we need to think critically about when it comes to glorifying resilience, especially if we're doing it for individual gain or to showcase individual strength, without realizing that actually the opposite of resilience is loneliness. We have to remember the communal and community contribution to the ability to even be resilient.
I love that. Because on a personal note, it really feels refreshing to reinvest in the understanding that community is where it's at. Because we're at a time in history where it feels, no matter your perspective, like the world is burning down around us. We want to trust that we will still be standing. And to do it, we need to know when to be optimistic and when to be strategically pessimistic. We need to know not to beat ourselves up when we're coming up against something called moral injury. And we want to embrace certain ways of thinking, cognitive flexibility for those who want the big words, and to hold on to the hope for the collective above all. Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We are your multi-ethnic hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha.
Welcome back. Could you please introduce yourself again to our listeners?
Yes, thank you. To both of you, I'm delighted to be here again. My name is Soraya Chemaly, and I am a journalist and a feminist cultural critic. I write freelance investigative pieces that are published in a whole range of outlets, and I have just released my second solo book, which is called The Resilience Myth, New Thinking on Grit, Strength, and Growth, which I will say is not my ideal subtitle. Is a good subtitle, I think, for the publishing industry. The one word I really wanted in there that didn't make it in was new thinking about the ethics of care. That framework is really the framework of the book, which follows up on my first book, which was called Rage Becomes Her.
Which shifted our perspective on how we are okay as women to be angry. We're allowed to have a voice to feel these things. And I'm so excited to now be able to talk about your second solo book.
And your book. We have to mind meld.
Right? Ours, the Dear White Women, Let's Get Uncomfortable Talking About Racism book. There were definitely some parts about structural, like looking at structures and history. And I feel like I need to set the stage for how your book helps all of us reframe what resilience means, because we're looking at a country in tumultuous times, both now and probably a little bit more ahead. And resilience, as I think Americans know it, is pitched as this worthwhile, respected trait. Oh, they're so resilient. They've got this toughness. They can bounce back. What do you see as wrong about how we discuss resilience in America? How do we need to shift our thinking from individual to collective?
So that is the core of it, right? I think that it's hyper individualistic because we live in a hyper individualistic culture. So it is of the culture, which is, I think, point number one. But what's happened is that our concept of resilience is practically indistinguishable in many ways from bootstrapping stories, right? You have a person, they experience a moment in their lives that is horrifying or scary or sad, and yet they have the internal capacity, the skills or the traits or the mindset to overcome, that's a big word, right? To overcome the hardship, the adversity. And then not only do they overcome it, but the myth is, grow from their pain. They're better people because of it. That's a very prevalent idea. You know, when we see people experiencing horrible circumstances, it's often the case that they will be told they're resilient as a form of flattery. But in fact, that's not particularly helpful to someone who's experiencing hardship. The helpful thing is the relationships, is the mutual care, is the collective resources that they might be able to rely on in their worst times.
It's so true, right? And I want to extend that then, because we talk about, when you talk about this context of the care and the community, what you're talking about is, I feel like there are systemic and structural barriers in place for certain people in this country, and they're constantly coming up against that. And that can wear you down over time if you don't either have people in your life or you don't have systems that are shifting to allow,
You have no resources.
yeah, the resources, right? And I think when we glorify this individual resilience, it's not accurate. But I think the other part that hit me hard was this, takedowns may be a strong word, this reasonably critical look at positive psychology and the way we have started studying the science of thriving. It's a field, as a life coach who is trained in and appreciates positive psychology, that is close to my heart. I love the field because it applies the science of well-being. It examines using, scientific methods, what's working in theory for the masses, instead of only focusing on the few who are not functioning so well, which is sort of the traditional psychological look. But got me more curious about it was that it is centered on individual resilience, absent the social context that these people are in.
It totally erases it. That's right.
Or maybe it is just kind of focused on the rich white male context, especially if some of these studies were conducted 100 years ago, these longitudinal studies that have been around. It can mean then that the results are not as accurate or as widely applicable.
Absolutely. And we see that over and over and over again, right? Happiness studies, hardiness studies, optimism studies. And I think the key is to consider what it means to decontextualize a person's life experiences from the circumstances of their society, right? Historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. They're all types of things that are not pegged to a single event in life. The presumption in that idea that you will encounter an adversity that you will have to adapt to and overcome, the presumption is that your pre-existing state was pretty A-okay, And so in addition to removing the context of a person's life and their relationship to other people or to the state itself, right? Like an oppressive relationship, for example, it completely depoliticizes what's happening when what's happening might be a direct result of our collective politics. And that's one of the biggest issues I have with positive psychology. It's super individualistic, erases our interdependencies, our relationships living in community, and it doesn't even touch on the incredible hierarchies that exist in our society, and what resources are then distributed so inequitably in that society, including health or medical care or education or just having food on the table, I think that's a really pretty big flaw.
Yeah. When you hear it, it makes sense, right? If you're systematically not getting the same resources that someone else gets, of course, you would think as a human being, yeah, that might be harder to make it through life. There was a 2014 study that you shared that said among people who were asked to lift the same heavy object, those who felt that they had lower levels of power and social status reported that the object felt physically heavier. That's mind blowing that people who perceive themselves to have different levels of social status or power can feel something is heavier. Something is harder for them. So that really impacts people's performance, the resilience, their ability, the weight that they have to carry around.
There are now many studies that really indicate that while having an optimistic approach to life is genetic partially, some people are just more optimistic, right? But overwhelmingly, optimism is tied to social class and status. And that's been shown repeatedly, and that just makes sense. It's like the saying, money can't buy you happiness. That is true, but money can buy you sleep. It can buy you better health. It can buy you security. It can buy you all kinds of things that may not make you happy, but will reduce your stress, will make your life easier, will facilitate your progress through life. So I think that the same thing stands for things like optimism. I'm a big proponent of strategic pessimism and the idea that instead of our thinking we should strive always to be optimistic, we should embrace cognitive flexibility. There are really good times to use optimism, and there are equally good times to think about the bad things because it helps you strategize, it helps you plan, it actually helps you adapt more quickly and effectively. And yet what we end up with is a lot of people embracing optimism as a dimension of positive psychology that is unhinged from limits. It is truly toxic.
Two thoughts that I had on that. One was that it feels like a really appropriate challenge to an industry that prides itself on scientific rigor to come up with better metrics to measure people's, like, where are they coming from in order to be at this psychological study table today? And how do you adequately and accurately measure that so that can be incorporated into your studies in a scientific manner? So, hey, positive psychologists out there, please, let's start brainstorming about this sort of thing. The second thing is my cousin, I recently had a family reunion, and what you said about strategic pessimism rung true for me on a personal level, because he said, I really enjoy talking to people who actually are diagnosed with some level of anxiety because they think more. They're constantly strategizing and they're looking for ways to stay safe. They notice more, and I find them very interesting to speak to.
That's super funny because I was joking with my kids and some friends that I definitely have had periods in my life where I feel anxious very like deeply, but I'm definitely your unfun facts person at the dinner party. I get super bored. I do. I'm just like, seriously? First of all, none of this is real. Like, like no one's feeling this way. And so my squirrely brain really makes me that person who's like, maybe no. Maybe these bad things are happening. But it does alleviate, it does spur conversation. And if you don't mind being that person because that's who you are, like, I'm going to hide from it. That's very funny. I wanted to say one other thing, though, to your point about research. What I found in doing the research for this book is that so many studies relied on people self-reporting. That's super hard to count on and super hard to analyze, I think. One of the best studies I saw was noted that and actually said, okay, we're going to ask, it was after 9/11. It was, I think, George Bonanno ran the study. He spent a lot of time after 9/11 studying bereavement and resilience and all of these ideas. And they asked a bunch of people who'd been there, their trajectory, their post-traumatic trajectory. And the first thing they found was that overwhelmingly, and this is just true, most of us are resilient. We will return to a place of stability and happiness and purpose. But the second thing they found was that a lot of people were quite delusional in their sense of how well they were doing. So they reported that they had actually recovered, that they were resilient, that they were doing really well, which would have been the typical kind of study. How are people doing? But in this study, they went further and they then studied those people's friends, families, and acquaintances. And there was just a massive gap between the self-reported perception, which was self-enhancing, and the perception of family members and friends who might, for example, say, actually, no, he's really not doing so well at all. He's not really functioning. Our relationship has changed immensely, whatever the difference might be. And I think we need more of that.
I think that's really interesting that, the individual perception versus like everyone who's actually around you and their perception of how well you're doing. And I also want to go back to strategic pessimism for a minute, because as a lawyer, right, like that, and I have been called also the fun sponge in my family, because I too am that person who's like, you know what? Like there are things out there.
Fun sponge is so much nicer. My family called me the fun killer.
That's so funny. Fun sponge is good. I'm going to remember both of those, though.
I love this idea because especially having worked in the fitness industry for a while and seeing sort of unbridled optimism peddled in so many different ways in a very individual way, right? Completely devoid of social context. This is it. What you wrote about in this book sort of put some words to what I had thought about certain things for a long time. So that was super helpful. When you also wrote about the concept of hardy resilience, right? And I love this because this was so key to Rage Becomes Her, I think, in terms of thinking about how gender and sex are involved here, right? Because that idea of hardy resilience being just the male model was really eye-opening, because even more shocking, I think, was the idea, and I think Sarah and I both felt this, right, of women's resilience basically being that we need to be elastic, right, like for everyone. And it reminds me especially given now that I'm in my late 40s, like how we adopt male standards for things like health and are only just now considering like perimenopause or menopause and how all of these factors contribute to, women's health, but actually, in fact, like our collective societal health and societal well-being. So, similarly to what you and Sarah were discussing with positive psychology, like how do we shift that focus away from sort of this male model of resilience and get researchers to study what it takes for that collective resilience? Like, how do we do
I mean,
that?
I think that's really the question, right? I remember in 2014, I wrote an article for Time magazine about why it was that women were still standing in lines at public bathrooms as though we didn't exist in public space. And in the first article that I wrote, that was the focus, but I went on and wrote about all the other ways in which a male standard of being embodied, and not just male, but able-bodied male, right? Solo male, an independent man walking through a city, uses a public bathroom in a way that a woman may be taking care of the elderly or having children or having lots of bags or maybe having a disability or maybe trying to avoid street harassment. I mean, there are a million differences, but the bathrooms that we build are just calibrated to the first, right? They're small, they're insufficient, they're designed at the same size, even though women need bathrooms 4 times more often because they have kids, all of these things. And that's true of our medical studies. It's true of our air conditioning. It's true of, like, there's nothing that it is not true about, honestly. But trying to change that is super hard because now what's happened in addition to the fact of that is that all those studies have been used to generate machine learning, right? And so now it's in the world of AI. And that's a massive challenge to me. Like, not only do we have to start doing the research, but we now have to somehow create some kind of fire hose to swamp out what exists. I mean, it's so depressing, right? Because you would think in this day and age, after 60 years of things like women's liberation movement in the US and women in the workplace and birth control pills, that we wouldn't be in this dire situation. But we are. I mean, we're still talking about things like this. I mean, I'm 58. I remember talking about this in 1988, right? I remember talking about it in 1998, in 2008. I'm like, what is this? And ultimately, to me, a lot of it has to do with a cultivated ignorance in men. They can choose not to know. And part of our socialization is to not make them uncomfortable. The same things you talk about in terms of white discomfort, in terms of entitlement to comfort, in terms of shame, or all those feelings have parallels in this way. And so in the end, I think the studies have to, that the shift that has to come is a broader epistemic shift. What matters? How do we know things? Whose voices matter? I don't know what it's going to take. I just don't. But in terms of resilience, absolutely, it's gendered. And the normative dominant model of resilience that we have is kind of a proxy for an idealized hegemonic masculinity, strength, mental toughness, self-sufficiency, all of those things. Agency, and again, entitlements to all the things that prop that up. Women's free labor, other people's domestic labor, care that's going on. We just erase all of that.
We do. We erase all of that. And until we either get more women in positions of influence and power or more money dedicated to the cause, which would have to come from those who have it now, which are still primarily men that have a lot of the wealth.
I mean, the amount of money being poured into Donald Trump's campaign right now by billionaires is scary and shocking.
Especially when you consider the platform
That's right.
that they're running on, which runs counter to everything we just said we need in order to build a more equitable society that honors women's labor, that allows women to have jobs or have bodily autonomy or to do any of these things. If we consider we're not many decades away from when women couldn't have a credit card without their man.
Yeah. I mean, that state senator Grothman, who a few years ago said maybe money's more important for men, just this week he made a speech in which he said, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, I really hope that this next president takes us down back to 1960. And before the feminists destroyed the country and took men's purpose away. I mean, he's very upfront about it. And I don't really know how anybody can dismiss this anymore because, that same attitude is the attitude that wants segregation, right? That like it's all the same thing. It's all the same fabric. And believe people when they tell you what they want. I mean, it's right here. It's out in the open. You have to deliberately shield yourself from the information.
I think we just channeled our inner fun killers, folks.
Totally.
But I did want to ask about, you talk in your book about resilience training and this on the like flip side, because sometimes I hear and I feel all the things that we're talking about, and I feel like, man, we're never going to bounce back from this. I feel down. I'm not going to just bounce back from this. But there was one part of it which is not relevant necessarily to me bouncing back from this, but this concept of moral injury was interesting to me. When someone makes choices or does things that violates their core values or their sense of themselves, how is this idea of moral injury incompatible with resilience training? Like, how does that show up in our real life so we can maybe not beat ourselves up for not being as resilient as we hope?
So I think that what has happened a lot to people who experience truly horrific things. So typically soldiers in war, right? Or people who are sexually assaulted. People who are sexually assaulted and they don't fight back and feel that, wait, what happened, right? I didn't think that was me. Like there's this quality of, I would never do that. I would never shoot someone and kill them, or I would never not stand up for whatever it is. But that sense of moral injury that somehow you've betrayed yourself, you've betrayed your ethics, your morals, was also very prevalent in the early days of COVID for doctors and nurses who were expected to make heroic sacrifices and ultimately forced to make decisions that felt like betrayals of their oaths to care for people, And the trouble is that moral injury sometimes gets confused with post-traumatic stress disorder, but they're very different and they require different approaches. And yet that distinction isn't often made. So what might work for a person who has PTSD will not work for someone. Because if you are a person who's suffering from moral injury, for example, being upset confirms your sense of self. It is the thing that allows you to feel like yourself because, in fact, you're sustained by the idea that you can still maintain being horrified by the thing that is horrible, right? And so resilience then also becomes different. What you might have to do to be resilient in the face of moral injury probably is not what positive psychology would suggest. You have to grapple with the horrible thing. You have to think about what you did and how you did it and what led you to that. I mean, one of the points I make in the book is, why do we call soldiers' traumatic responses a disorder? I just never understand this. Like, to do what soldiers have to do sometimes is deeply horrifying to any person who considers themselves a good person. And yet we think of it as a disorder instead of this is a healthy response to the evisceration of life, for example. And so if you take that whole framework of resilience and you think, well, how do you deal with accepting that mental distress is necessary, is valuable? It's a completely different orientation, right? And I think that that's worth exploring. I think that telling someone with moral injury that they just need to buck up and develop mental toughness and write a gratitude journal and whatever it may be, there's so many things, right? That's never going to help that person. And so instead, again, for me, one of the responses is if we can think of resilience relationally instead of atomistically, instead of saying what's inside this person, what skills can they develop, what behaviors can they change, I think we should be more focused on saying, how can this community, how can we help this person? How can we accept them? How can we acknowledge that we asked the soldiers to do this thing? How can we acknowledge that a rape victim freezes because that's what saved their lives, right? Like there are all kinds of dynamics that go into insisting that someone be resilient or even congratulating them for being resilient that ignore all of that.
I think that's such an important point. And, I guess he's now going to be a seventh grader, went to DC for a week. And during that time period, they went to visit a lot of the war memorials and went to the Vietnam War Memorial and had this big discussion about how these soldiers were turned away from communities upon returning because what they did was so terrible for themselves and the communities rejected them because of what they had done. So your point about, and and he really felt this deeply, like that this was horrible because these soldiers were so young a lot of the time and didn't necessarily believe in what they were doing, but had to do this. And then the community response was so separate and horrible in its own way. So, and talking about my son is why I want to ask this next question. But I'm going to preface it by saying two things. First, I am a huge fan of Anne Helen Peterson. And so your interview in this recent newsletter of hers was like worlds colliding in the best way, which I immediately forwarded to Sarah and was like, you have to read this because she's great. And so the second thing I want to preface this question with is, I ask this as someone who has used the word unprecedented too many times since, I don't know, like 2015, right? As so many things have happened in this society and world that I would have never predicted, let alone the things that have happened, I don't know, just this past weekend or past month or past half year. And I think about the generations like my sons growing up now and how we've come down hard on them a lot of times for not being resilient in the way that we use the word resilient. So you and Anne had this great sort of, Q&A part about this stemming from your statement that younger people aren't distressed because they lack the right mindset or don't understand what is happening around them. They're distressed because the world is distressing and adults have failed them. And I thought that was so important. So can you say more about this? And so how does this help frame like how we interact and with our youth and teach our youth and support them?
Yeah, I feel very strongly about this. I wrote about this for The Nation too when campus protests were ongoing, because in fact, this generation of young people has been routinely called out for their lack of resilience, for their lack of grit, for their whininess, for their like all the things. And I think that's pretty kind of cruel and irresponsible. These kids live in an they live with social and technical acceleration. They have more information in a day than their parents and grandparents could have had in half a lifetime in a lifetime. They are processing a lot of information. They live in a highly networked environment. They're exposed to more people, more diversity, more difference. They are really good at navigating those things in ways that older people struggle with. But they also, I think, are aware of how, as you said, unprecedented, but fundamentally unpredictable their futures are. Every generation, I think, of human before now could have looked forward and envisioned a life quite like their parents or their grandparents, particularly if you were white, particularly if you were in the United States, right? And that was just the 20th century ideal, like progress, capitalist expansion, all of those things. But these kids aren't stupid. They have crisis after crisis after crisis. They grew up with gun violence that was unremitting and unaddressed largely. They've had to start their own movements to end that violence for climate mitigation. Like they are savvy and smart. And so, in my mind, they show incredible adaptability and resilience. It's just not what a lot of older people want, which ultimately I think is conformity. I think it is an authoritarian parenting mindset to say, just suck it up, wake up, go to work, do the things I did, and you'll be fine. That is not true. That is not going to work for these kids. And so I just think they deserve more credit for what they're going through. And also, I will add this. I found this fascinating. There was a study done maybe in Australia of, I want to say it was maybe 2,000 students, and they were ranging in age from maybe 13 to 18. And some of them had a lot of anxiety and depression and distress, and the others didn't. And so they thought, well, what if we introduce a resilience program where we use positive psychology, we give them good habits, we teach them to breathe and meditate and use gratitude journals and to develop resilient skills, but again, as individuals, right? This is things that they have to add to their day. They have to learn how to, like, first of all, they have to add all these activities to their already pressureful days. And what they found after the period of study was that kids were worse off. Even kids who weren't distressed before were now distressed. Because in fact, keeping a journal or meditating or thinking about your problems and how to overcome them causes rumination. And if you're a kid and you're thinking about all these things and you're simultaneously being told it's up to you to develop strength, you could probably feel pretty abandoned, right? You could feel like, wait, what am I supposed to do about this? That's hopeless. That's helpless. It's just not great, you know? And so I just think that treating children like little adults is also not helping them. They're not little adults. They're like developing human beings with different needs, including needing to be cared for, you know? And I just think that's a really critical piece that's missing.
Yeah, I think that study in particular really highlights the need for that collective care, right? Because when you take kids, especially, and treat them as those individuals, wow, that I think about, you know, COVID and the aftermath of sort of raising children who were in these silos for a long time and sort of broke that collective mentality, and how some of that has been rebuilt and some of that has not been at all rebuilt. Despite that, right, these generations are still finding their voice and seeing this world, that they're coming into, to your point, that they know it's going to look really different than the world that exists right now, and the information that they have around that, and, what their role is in that, I think it's tough.
Yeah, and I think that protest and activism, you don't do that unless you have hope. You don't have to be optimistic to be hopeful, you know? Like that's happy coincidence, but hope is a very different thing. It actually means you believe you can, it's like anger. You believe you can make change. You are invested in your own future. You might be angry, you might be sad, you might be confused, but if you are actively engaging in the civic sense, then you definitely haven't given up. You're not despondent. You're saying, wait, time out. And I do think that younger people have, many of them, a much more collectivist ethos. They're like, we all sink or swim. We will be allies across these movements. We're going to show up for Black Lives Matter. We're going to show up for Palestinians. We're going to show up for anti-Semitism. We're going to do all the things that we think is necessary for us to care for each other. And I think that's important, you know?
And to point out the difference, I feel like maybe we touched briefly on politics before and the direction that we're taking. I think we all see that there is a problem with, for example, the idea of childcare. Like childcare is a crisis in this country, but what we're hearing those who are into Project 25, their solution is let's go back to the 1960s. Let's have women care for this. Whereas we're missing, like the younger generation and most of the other countries in the world can come up with creative solutions, universal healthcare, childcare, like safety nets that are in place that don't require the 1960s model of family where a woman who is only married to a man and then has to solely be responsible for caring for and nurturing this next generation. There's other ways that we can do this, and it's time we step into that ability and energy to come up with creative solutions that are out there.
You don't even have to come up with them. There's so many examples.
Yeah.
Part of our problem is American exceptionalism. Like we never look to the rest of the world to say, why is it that over there, those people have such a higher quality of life, better health, happier people? That's all true, you know? And so, yeah, I think that we just are not, we're just unwilling. We have such a split in our society, right? Like we really genuinely have a worldview split that is quite profound. And that's always been true. I don't think that's actually new. I think we're just experiencing this iteration of it, and it's bad. This iteration of it is very bad.
I definitely agree with all of that. And, you touched on this like a couple of times, but I would love for you to say more about like how this concept of cognitive flexibility, which I love that term in particular, helps us address this feeling, right? That the world, or maybe it's just me, feels like the world is sort of burning around us, or we have that there, I don't know, all these feelings that come up.
Yeah, I mean, it's scary. The change is scary. The risks are real. I think the thing about cognitive flexibility is that it goes hand in hand with another feature of resilience, which is openness to difference, openness to change. And a third thing, which is the acceptance of limits. I think that's really important that we haven't talked about. Our entire cultural identity has to do with limitlessness. A lot of that, I think, comes from the Judeo-Christian, particularly evangelical Christian and Catholic traditions of life after death, of the promise of the eternal perfection that you can achieve. But even things like the frontier mentality that the country's expansion was built on, the idea that there was uninhabited empty land limitlessly available, right? Just erase entire nations of people in your estimation of what counted as people. The thing about adversity and hardship is, though, they usually represent limits on your ability to do certain things, limits on your relationships, limits on your world. And I mean, whatever it may be, you're dealing with a hard limit. And so if you don't allow that limit to crush you, if you say, okay, that's a limit. I have to acknowledge that that happened. How can I be a different person? How can I have different dreams? What can I be open to? How can the world look different? And how can I find my meaning, connection, place, and purpose? And some people really struggle with that because the threat to their core identity can be truly overwhelming. But others are, again, I think, have the flexibility cognitively to say, oh, that's a loss I have to grieve. But also, there are other ways of being in relation to even yourself or to the people around you or to your society.
That idea of limits, I mean, I know we were speaking on an individual level, but it also reminded me of this limitlessness that corporate America feels like it's taken,
Capitalism.
right? And then humans have limit. We will burn out. We are not an unlimited resource. All of these things. It's both systemic and individual.
That's absolutely true. And I think it goes along with the idea of progress. Like in the book, I try and show the way the idea of progress is itself conflated with white male identity and historically, how it's not just that we inherited a system that's hierarchical and that puts at the top of that hierarchy a kind of rational white guy, because that is what it does. It is that that guy also exists with a temporal advantage, which is that is recognized culturally as being able to envision the future and embrace progress and enact progress in a way that other people aren't. And that is a limitless entitlement, and I think we see that every day in our politics still. And so we do have to grapple, I think, with limitless. It's like the degrowth movement. A lot of people are like, absolutely degrowth. And others are like, oh my God, you're going to destroy the nation. You're going to destroy the world. You're going to destroy the future.
But your philosophical point that you made, I highlighted it in the book because it spoke to me. This idea of if we're constantly chasing progress, if we're constantly saying we must be resilient and grow and change and achieve more, are we ever good enough? Are we ever enough?
And I think for children too, this is just a correlation that I noticed. There's no study that I've seen. But, with the rise of resilience ideology, positive psychology, growth mindset work, grit work, we saw a corollary in the rise of perfectionism in children. And they could be unrelated, but I don't think they're unrelated in that exactly what you just said. If you have to constantly strive, if the baseline for whatever you do is that you can always improve, what is the end of that? How are you ever supposed to be satisfied with what you have achieved or accomplished or done or want? There's no being satisfied. It's just this eternal quest for perfection. Because what is the purpose of that except to keep improving yourself, And sure, there are ways like lifelong learning is a wonderful thing, but that's different from saying that you need to constantly strive to be better, to do better. And being better and doing better get confused, right? Because then if you don't do better, it becomes the fact that you aren't being better and then you're full of shame, right? That's a totally toxic dynamic.
Totally. What else haven't we asked that you would like to share with our listeners?
Oh my goodness. The thing that's really striking me all the time is that in trying to urge people to think relationally, right? To think it doesn't all have to be on your shoulders and it doesn't all have to happen now. Like so many of the things that people have to develop resilience to took place over decades, if not centuries, right? We know that. And we don't really have a resilience model outside of kind of indigenous models of resilience, which I write about a little bit, but we don't address that. We just keep talking about what you as an individual can do to feel better and to get past this problem. So what I say is that if in your concept of resilience, you can think of opposites, I would come up with the opposites of resilience traditionally being frailty, weakness, a lack of strength, not enough fortitude, not enough grit. Those are all things we associate with the opposite of resilience. But I think the opposite of resilience is actually loneliness. And that's a completely different framework for thinking about resilience because, in fact, the most anti-resilient thing that can happen in a person's life is for them to be lonely, to be cut off from other people, to be cut off from meaning or belonging or community. And that's sort of one of the things, because in fact, even people who have that grit or resolve, they can't have it in every instance over the entire course of their lives. It's just impossible, and so we shouldn't demand it of people either, because it will never work.
I feel like loneliness comes up a lot. It's really an interesting framework to discuss that, especially when you consider resilience in the context of community. And if we don't have that community, if we don't have that structural support, of course we feel lonely. Of course we feel like we don't matter. And so what is there worth living for, right? What would I strive for and come back to?
And also, I will say that in our culture, it's not only what is there worth living for, the despair of that, but we also have a very prevalent strain of, how can I put it, necropolitics, of nihilism that is outwardly focused, the mass shootings, the sacrifice zones of people, just death, right? Like we can end on a really low note here if we want to.
Bring the sponge on.
But what I will say is that, again, we talk about loneliness, particularly in boys and men, like it's a personal problem for them. And it is, but it's so much more than that, right? It's so much more, because the reasons why men are increasingly lonely have to do with the fact that they don't learn the importance of these feminine attributes, the connections, the caring, the emotional competence, the cognitive flexibility to reject rigid masculine norms that call for all of those things, right? The homophobia that's implicit in all of that. So I just think that focusing on the connection between resilience and loneliness could be super generative in very positive ways as we approach both problems. I didn't end on a low note.
A little hope right there.
Absolutely. I'm super hopeful. Like, I'm super excited by young people.
Well, where can people find you?
They can find me on Instagram. I have a Rage Becomes Her account is where I usually share a lot of book thoughts and political news. Twitter. I'm not really active on Facebook except through Instagram. And that's pretty much it. I'm kind of low-key idling on the social media front.
We feel that. We feel that, and we're right there with you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this time with us.
Thank you both so much. It's terrific, to see you actually as we talk. That's always fun. And to talk to you. I'm really delighted. And congratulations too on your book and your work and your podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha. Yes, we're on social media. And yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book. But the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.